If you run a manufacturing business and want to manage your clients with ease, a CRM could be just what you need. Why? Let me show you. Manufacturing is one of the most important industries on the planet, providing a vital piece to any supply chain. Without the element that generates the products that consumers want, the entire chain is compromised. To put it bluntly, if no one makes it, there's no product to sell. And if you can't fulfill an order demand, it's typical for the customer to find someone who can. Which is why, as the owner of a manufacturing business, it's vital that you stay cost efficient and organized in order to stay profitable. And this is where a CRM system can transform a good business into a thriving one. Here's how it does it. CRMs excel at managing relationships between stakeholders. If you supply directly to a number of different organizations, maintaining those relationships can be a full-time job in itself. But managing those conversations doesn't need to be confined to a book or a traditional spreadsheet where smaller details might get lost easily. A CRM like the Sugar platform that we're using here can host everything that you need across your business. It can allow you to break down discussions about almost anything: contract renewals and new business leads, details of recurring orders that can be adjusted quickly, booked meetings, and anything else that you feel is important can be stored here. This means that building on the relationships that you have with your clients can be managed nice and easy. If your company manufactures to order, like with high value goods such as cars, it's likely that you invoice on a per job basis. Doing that manually for each customer is quite a tedious manual admin job. However, tools within CRMs can make this easy for you by automating the process to just simply a button press. CRMs will often contain a feature that can take details from existing records and place them onto any document for you. For instance, Sugar CRM's Doc Merge feature takes details from any information stored against your clients and places it onto a template. Then a document is generated with all of the information you want in the format you want it, ready to be sent to the customer. They can even be sent directly to your other software where applicable via integrations. Every invoice you create can automatically be sent to your accounting software, ready for processing. That's just one example of the power of CRM automation that can give you back more time to your day for the tasks most important to you. While the day-to-day features of a CRM can help improve the way you work, it's important to work smart and look ahead to the future. This is where the power of reporting proves the worth of a CRM. Knowing what you've got in the immediate term will help you do business now, but a CRM's reporting suite can help shape your future. Reports will take any raw data set you feed it and turn it into a visual graph or chart that makes it easy to understand. So for example, here in Sugar, reports can present the performance of your offerings, so if a particular product is performing better than others, you can reallocate resources to fulfill those high demand products. It can also help identify trends in market demand so you can make informed, data-driven decisions about your future. If you're still unsure about adding a CRM to your workflow, most providers will include a free trial period to make sure that the product is right for you. Here at Enable, we can assist with a CRM solution designed for you. We're happy to help with any questions you might have about using a CRM in your business. Either get in contact with us using the links in the description or leave us a comment below. We also offer a 30-day trial to our preferred partner Sugar CRM, which offers services for sales and marketing with Sugar Sell and Sugar Market respectively. You can access this using the link accompanying this video. But if you're still unsure about the benefits of Sugar CRM, then check out this video up here where we dive deeper into what a CRM is and why we think that Sugar CRM could be the thing you're looking for. That's all from me. Thank you for watching and have a great day.